When we are introducing ourselves, we are going to be talking about favorite OTP, favorite romantic pairing from some media, and if our main characters would have an OTP themselves. So Mariama, would you like to start?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Mariama Lockington, the author of Forever Is Now. It just came out a few weeks ago. And it's a book about a girl who is living with anxiety. She's a poet, she's an activist, and what happens over one summer when she becomes mostly housebound, but still wants to be an activist. And one of my favorite on-screen or just media romance pairings is Anna Green Gables and Gilbert Blythe. I love that book, and I also loved the 1980s movie. And I think if my main character, Sadie, were to pick a favorite romantic pairing, she's a poet, so she brings in a lot of different writers into this story, and one of those is Zora Neale Hurston, and specifically from the book Their Eyes Were Watching God. So I think she would say Tea Cake and Janie in that story. But ultimately, she's about self-love, which I think is also why she would pick that.
I love that. All right, Raquel.
All right. Hello, I'm Raquel. I'm the author of You Don't Have a Shot. It is a YA romance that is sapphic rivals to lovers soccer book. I got those scrambled up in my head for a second. But it's about Valentina Castillo-Green, who has to work alongside her longtime rival, Leticia Ortiz, to co-captain an inexperienced soccer team at the summer camp that they grew up and met at. And one of my favorite fictional couples of all time is Charlotte and Jamie from the Charlotte Holmes series by Brittany Cavallaro that I've talked about many times online. So I've garnered a reputation for loving them. And I think if Valentina had to pick a favorite fictional couple, I think Clark and Lexa from The 100 would probably be up there for her, because sapphic rivals, enemies, angry girls would probably be quite her brand with how she experiences romance.
98% of my knowledge of the 100 comes from Raquel online. Rosalind.
Yeah, I think one of the most iconic romantic pairings for me is Beatrice and Benedict. I mean, I think it's hard to rival their banter in Much Ado. And I'm really excited for the new Much Ado About Nada that came out yesterday. Anyway, I think I'm cheating a little bit. My characters are living in 1818, and so I think it would have to be Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice.
Very fair, very fair. And Adiba.
Hi, I'm Adiba Jagardar, and I'm the author of The Do's and Donuts of Love. And it's basically a YA rom-com about this Bangladeshi Irish girl called Shirin, who enters a Great British Bake Off style reality TV show where she ends up competing against her crush and ends up competing against her ex and a new crush. And things get very messy, both in terms of baking and in terms of feelings. So my OTP has actually already been mentioned, because I do have a lot of OTPs, but this is one that like really ripped my heart out. And it is Clark and Lexa. And I think Shirin's OTP would be Tara and Darcy from Heartstopper, because, you know, they're like sapphic relationship goals. And so I think Shirin would really relate to that.
And yes, you will be hungry when you read The Do's and Donuts of Love, for anyone who has not yet gotten the chance to read it. So one of the things that I've noticed just in general with book conversations and panels and a lot of stuff like that is we only talk about world building when it comes to sci-fi and fantasy. But in these books, we have a lot going on, right? We've got our baking competition in Do's and Donuts of Love. We've got this whole like soccer camp, and we've got to deal with all these like soccer teams and too much like sports stuff. I don't like sports, but I love this book, so that's good writing, right? We have this whole like social season and like the Regency, and then in Forever Is Now, we've still got like a lot of internal world building, right? She's sort of dealing with mental health and being sort of housebound, but at the same time sort of wanting that community and wanting to help her community. So there is still like other things happening that are maybe not in front of you as a reader, but are definitely like at the forefront of her mind. And so what is that world building process like for you all? How do you know when you're building out the worlds to be sort of just realistic? And how do you know when you're like, oh no, I'm getting a little too deep into this. We have a little too many spreadsheets going. Like, we need to focus back on our main person. Anybody want to go first? I will start calling on you. Raquel.
I can go. For You Don't Have a Shot, the book takes place at this fictional soccer camp, and they are competing for 8 weeks. And I think there's 10 teams. I don't remember exactly. I had to actually plan out who plays every single week, like what all the matches are, what the scores are at the end of every single week. This is not in the book though, but I had to figure it out so that I knew like who would be in the final game at the end of the season. And that was just fun for me because yeah, in contemporary, you don't think as much about world building, or in books like that aren't as secondary world. But those were a lot of the details I had to do. And just in general, when writing contemporary, one of the biggest things for world building with me is having like a large cast of characters around the main characters and making them feel fleshed out. And I think knowing that if I jumped into another side character's head, there could be a story still going on, that there's enough I've given about those characters to feel like the world is fleshed out. That is a good marker for me of when I've done enough detail. I tend to go overboard with too many characters. This is probably the most characters I'm ever going to get away with in a book because I had to do a whole soccer team and a whole soccer camp. But that's really how I kind of thought about crafting this world in this book.
I can talk a little bit about Forever Is Now. So this book is interesting because my main character spends a good portion of the book inside of her house and just in her little neighborhood. But one thing that was really fun for me while writing this book was I had to create a brand new social media platform because one of the ways that Sadie, my main character, stays in touch with her friends and her crush, she has a very messy love life. She like breaks up with a girlfriend in the beginning and then has a new crush that moves in next door, and she's queer, and so she's figuring that all out. But she's also living with agoraphobia and general anxiety disorder and really struggling over the summer. So I wanted to figure out how do you still participate in your community and in activism when you're really struggling with leaving a safe space. And so I actually did get on TikTok for research, and now I love it and I'm on it all the time. But I got on TikTok to sort of see what elements of TikTok I could use to then create a social media activist platform that Sadie begins to use as sort of a live journal and a way to connect with other young people who are struggling with their mental health, and then eventually to organize some action around something that happens that she wants to participate in. So that was actually a really fun bit of world building and thinking about how social media, yes, can be a time suck and a distraction, but also how it can be a lifeline for a lot of young people and people in general to find their communities and find their voice. And so that was some fun world building as far as my character being very sort of insular, but at the same time being able to connect worldwide with young people around her.
I also had a lot of fun with world building because for anybody who doesn't know, in the Do's and Donuts of Love, there's a lot of puns. And because it's set in like the baking, like reality TV show, one of the first things that I actually did was I watched a lot of baking shows to do research. And then I was like, how do I make this show really punny, not just the book? And so I came up with the perfect judges, and I created these like very punny names for them. So the 3 judges are Galvin Cramsey, based off of Gordon Ramsay, Moira Cherry, based off of Mary Berry, and Padma Bollywood, based off of Paul Hollywood. And so I think once I kind of had that, I just started having a lot of fun with the world building and building up like just all of the baking elements of the reality TV show. And I think I really enjoyed that it's quite closed off. There are parts where, you know, sharing with their family and things, but overall it's a very closed off, like competitive space. So I just had a lot of fun building that.
Historical, so the world building is a little bit more typical. And I think that one of the great things about Regency is there's a lot of information online. Sorry, I'm in a classroom and the lights just, I guess there's a dimmer switch and they just went off. But now they're back on. But one of my favorite things that I did for research for this was I got a pattern and I made a corset and I made a dress and I went to a Regency retreat, and I had no idea how many layers. I mean, you watch those like Pride and Prejudice and it doesn't look like they have all that much going on, but like there's a lot of layers in those gowns, and that was really fun.
I'm always a big proponent of layers because you never know what temperature a building is going to be until you walk in and you're cold. So I do have a couple individual questions really quick, which I guess I'm just going to do reverse stack order because that's what's easiest. So Adiba, if this book was a baking recipe, what would be on the ingredients list?
That is actually such a difficult question. I feel like the ingredients list would be a lot of donuts, like as many donuts as you can possibly think of, more than that. And then a lot of sugar and sweetness in general, like a dash of South Asian culture, and then a lot of like sapphic romance, and then just a tiny bit of a love triangle. I think those would be all the ingredients for the recipe for this book.
Yes, that sounds right, having read the book. So Rosalind, you are balancing a bunch of different main characters in here. So how do you make sure that each of their journeys is one that like the reader is sort of wanting to follow equally? Ignore my father in the background. And sort of wanting to make sure that we want to get back to each character as we're going, and not just like maybe somebody does favor somebody more, but we like them all.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for me, it was really important that I kind of plot and I kind of pants a little bit, but it was really important for me that I at least plan out the major plot points so that they hit them at the same time, so that at least pacing wise and tension wise, they were hitting the same thing. And it was also really important to me that each girl had her own goals and that they felt realistic and fleshed out, that they felt like a whole individual. So hopefully that means that they're equally compelling. I know from what readers have said, some people have favorites, but yeah, that's a great question.
It's fair to have a favorite, but we want to still love everybody equally. Raquel, we have a rivals to lovers here, and I would like to also say an enemies to lovers, but the enemy is herself and the lovers is self-love. How do you make an effective rivals to lovers where you still have the adrenaline of that type of relationship, but don't make it so that the reader is like, oh, these two people shouldn't actually even be in the same room together. Like they need to be physically separated at all times. Like how do we balance that?
I think it helps that this is rivals to lovers, not enemies to lovers. And like, because it's in a contemporary world, you know, like the stakes are lower. It's not like fantasy where they're trying to kill each other. But they do like physically fight in a game at the start of the book. So it is a journey to get them to a different place by the end. And I think what really helped is that, in my belief, what is built into rivals to lovers is like, to consider someone a rival, there's inherent respect there. Because if you're competing against someone and they're not skilled or a threat or whatever, that's just like a nuisance. They're not a rival. For someone to be a rival, they have to in some way threaten you or shake things up. And so a lot of maintaining the like dynamic they had while still getting to a point where like they're in love, but they still have the banter, and it's not, you're not wondering like, is this not going to work out for them well because they're going to fight with each other. It was really about preserving that respect and just sort of shaping how they go about addressing it. So in the start of the book, it's a lot of just like conceitedness and making fun of each other, but they get to a point where they can be almost sarcastic about it, and also use it to sort of hype the other one up. But like, I didn't spend all these years, you know, considering you a rival just for you to give up for this, you know, trying to still use that banter in a different way was very helpful, especially for these characters, because like you said, there is the enemies to lovers of self-love that they both struggle with. And I think for both of them, having someone who hates them at some point, but also finds a way to love them, that is a helpful element of building that, because I think that's the compelling thing for a lot of people for hate to love, the idea that someone can see all your faults and flaws and still get to a place where they can love you. So yeah, but also just having fun with banter and being able to do that throughout is nice for maintaining that dynamic so that you don't miss that adrenaline by the time they're at a happier place.
Yeah, that's always the fear, right? Is that they fall in love and then now they're just like boring. That's not the case here, to be clear. But I get how that might be a concern. Mariama, you write such beautiful verse, and it is so lovely, and your characters have these beautiful introspections throughout their whole journeys. But what was it about this? Because even in the Key of Us, like there is a love story, there is a lot of like stuff that we're overcoming. And that's similar here. What was wanting you to make the shift from middle grade to YA for this particular story?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it is a novel in verse. Poetry is like my core love when it comes to sort of form, but all my work is pretty hybrid. There's going to be a little bit of poetry and lyricism and everything. But I talk about this in the author note. I started writing this in June of 2020, which was pandemic, and I live in Kentucky, and Breonna Taylor had just been killed. And I was really struggling with my own mental health. And when I am struggling or when I'm feeling far away from people, I always turn to poetry. And Sadie's story sort of came out as this, slightly older teen girl who was in high school, who was experiencing all the things that you do as a high schooler, a messy love life, and sort of trying to vibe with her parents and it not always going that way, a little annoying brother, a best friend who really gets her, but also sometimes they don't always see eye to eye. And so writing in verse and then writing it as YA just made a lot of sense. And also, because of some of the things that she's dealing with. I mean, I think middle grade students are dealing with a lot of things these days. But it just made sense to have her have a little bit more access to social media, a little bit more freedom as far as spending time away from adults, for this story to come out, and then for her sort of romance to bloom with the next door neighbor that moves in too. So I really love writing middle grade, but I'm also really happy about writing this YA story and being in the YA space.
I know as readers, we're definitely happy to have you in both spaces. And I wrote a note on here on my little sheet that's like Shakespeare, poetry, romance, but I didn't flesh that out because I'm not the writer and I didn't know how to make that work as a sentence. So we're just going to go Shakespeare, poetry, romance and leave it at that. So when you are crafting, this is for everybody again, when you are crafting a love interest, how do you sort of balance the idea of it is a person who is going to fit with our main character and who is going to probably further their story, especially if they're not a point of view character, but also feel like they actually are also a person and not just ticking off boxes to fit the main character?
I can go first. So that's a really difficult question, actually. But with the Do's and Don'ts of Love, it was actually a little bit easier to do it because obviously there's two love interests, but one of the pivotal love interests is Shirin's ex-girlfriend. So I was already kind of working off a point where I had imagined, and I'd actually written a lot of when Shirin and Chris were together. So I already saw like a lot of who Chris was when she was with Shirin and who Chris was like separately from Shirin as well, because I had to see them together, see them separate, and then kind of develop the story from going on from there. I think like it is very, very difficult to kind of balance those two things, having someone who is complementing the character, but also ensuring that they, are their individual self. But essentially, it's kind of like what Raquel said earlier when she was talking about developing her side characters. You have to ensure that they kind of have their own little things going on, and that if you went off and wrote your own wrote like a short story about them, they would have something going on. You could actually kind of enter into their head and give them a story as well. It's definitely like a balancing act though, and it can be very, very tough to do, but I found it easier to do it with Chris in this book than I did with the other love interests and even like other love interests that I've written before.
I just want to note very quickly that even the birds around me were really interested in what you had to say because one flew smack into the window as you were speaking. So they really wanted to know about Shirin and Chris. So, it's all good.
I can go after. That, yeah, like I said earlier, that I use that same rule for my side characters as I did for the love interest in You Don't Have a Shot. And this was the first time I had ever written like a romance before, or a book where like it was a legitimate love interest that we were pursuing. So I wanted her to be very fleshed out, and I did want to accomplish that balance of like, she compliments Valentina, she's there for her, she works alongside her sort of character arc, but also not feel like she was basically a cardboard cutout that was just being propped up in the scene whenever we needed Valentina to have some type of character beat. And I think funnily enough, Adiba, you were saying about like having some type of history between the characters can help too, because since Valentina and Leticia are already rivals, the first time we see her, they already know each other and they're already like bantering with each other. So it helped get the dynamic right off the bat. And there was stuff that could be like a reference point. They have mutual acquaintances. So like I was able to build more of a history and more of a character story. So it felt like we were already in the middle of her story and not like introducing her at a starting point while we're introducing everything else. That was helpful for me. But also finding a way that both of their personal arcs could work alongside the romantic arc, I think was really helpful. So kind of being able to weave them all together accomplished like 3 things at once, and helped flesh out Leticia so she didn't just feel like a cardboard cutout, that both of them are struggling with very similar journeys of self-love and kind of weird not knowing what they deserve in relationships around them. So that was helpful because then they can help each other with it and not just feel like the love interest is there to help the main character, that it's a mutual thing.
I can go next. Like Raquel, this was my first time writing a story that was straight up romance. But then, of course, I decided to make it interesting by writing 3 point of view characters who each had a romantic arc. And that was a little bit tricky, but I think one of the things that was important for me was thinking about like, what does this character need? Who's going to challenge them the most in terms of what they need? And I actually had one character that I had written a different love interest in mind, and halfway through the story, it was clear to me that they were not going to work out. And so it ended up being a different character, which was kind of fun. But I think really thinking about who's going to challenge the main character, and then building them out from there. Like, what kind of person is this? Like you've all said, what are their independent interests? What kind of a life do they have outside of when they're interacting with this character?
Yeah, I very much relate to that too. I think in Forever Is Now, I guess technically there are 2 kind of love interests. Like I said at the beginning of the book, Sadie is sort of is with her girlfriends, and then her whole summer goes wrong when that relationship ends. And so the romance that blossoms a little later in the book is with sort of an unexpected boy next door who moves in. And I think that while they have, something in common or something that they recognize in one another, there's sort of a loneliness and a sadness and an introvertedness that they recognize in each other right away. They both sort of bond over the fact that neither of them are really sports people, but they have these sort of like non-traditional high school things that they do. Sadie boxes to relieve stress and anxiety, and Jackson is a cyclist, not a biker. He is a cyclist. And so they kind of recognize each other in that moment, but they also challenge one another. And I think that was really important. In the first draft, I didn't write that challenge well enough. And so part of revision was messing that up a little bit more, and what do they learn from each other over the course of this. And I also really wanted to make sure that, Sadie's romance with Jackson wasn't like, I want to get better for this boy, but more so like, how do I learn to love myself and work through my life, and also accept in love and help and community. And part of that is sort of the blossoming romance that happens with her and Jackson. So, and I also love what you said, Adiba, about the, about, can you take this character and write a whole separate story about them? I can think of that for Jackson as the love interest as well. And I think that's really important for a fleshed out love story, and then also characters.
I can't wait for all of the spin-offs that are not going to happen for all of these books. I also would love a, Rosalind, you said something and it made me think, if anyone ever feels like writing a book that's like a failed love interest support group, where it's like all of the rejected love interests that just didn't work out for the author, and they're all like just having it out with each other, So all of our characters at the beginning of the books sort of start with a plan in place for their immediate future, or for, you know, social season. Obviously they're like planning for like the future because like marriage, you know, woo. And then everything goes wrong, right? Everything falls off the rails. We get sabotaged, we get broken up with, we lose really catastrophically and fist fight on the soccer field pitch, whatever it's called. So things sort of go very wrong, right? And what I love about these books is that there is this lovely like romance, and there is this sort of like external love and validation that is coming through, but all of these characters are also going on these huge emotional journeys that are not necessarily related to the love interest. Like they're part of it, but they've got a huge other thing happening. And so how do you sort of help your main character through these like huge speed bumps without just like taking away the speed bump entirely and grinding it down so it doesn't mean anything? Like how do you make sure that they're getting through it but not making everything better immediately as much as you love them and care for them and want them to be happy at the end of the book, right? What's that balance? Okay, I'm calling on people. Rosalind, I don't think you've gone first yet, so I'm making you go first.
I was just going to unmute too. Yeah, for mine, I feel like it's a love story, but it's also very much a sister story. Two of the point of view characters are sisters and then their cousin. And I felt like having them sort of figure out that they can be individuals and they can still love and support each other really helped them get through those moments, you know, the inevitable third act breakup or whatever, because they had each other to lean on and help them kind of make realizations and realize that, yes, I love this person. Yes, he broke my heart, but I can still be a happy and fulfilled person, even if we don't get back together. And I think that was really the role of those secondary characters coming together and supporting. Well, I guess they're not secondary characters. They were all point of view characters, but coming together and supporting each other. So that sisterhood was really important for my story.
I think something similar with the do's and donuts of love as well, because Shirin kind of has the support of her parents at the end of the day, even if she doesn't have like anybody else. And she also has like Fatima, her best friend, even when she feels like she doesn't have Fatima, she still has her. So I think kind of building support systems for Shirin that she can rely on, and she can kind of trust that no matter what goes wrong in her life, she is going to have them to lean on one way or another. And one of the ways, for example, that Shirin's parents do it is that they don't come to her and talk to her. They're not like, oh, like, are you okay? Like, what's going on with you? They make her food and they put it in the fridge. And they're like, yeah, when Shirin's feeling better, she's going to go and she's going to like find food in the fridge. So I think even like having these very specific ways that Shirin knows her support system and how she's going to be supported also helps kind of just make things easier for her.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think in Forever Is Now, obviously the love story is important, but I also think the way I've been talking about this book, it's just also a book about community and love for your community and your city or your town, the people that you hold closest. And so even though Sadie is really struggling in a lot of ways, she's got a lot of people in her life who love and support her and who are holding her accountable. I think that's another thing about a main character or main characters is that you can't make them too perfect either, right? And Sadie is definitely a flawed human, as we all are. And those flaws come out in the book. And she's not always getting along with everyone, including her best friend, Evan, who she describes as she describes herself as like the bell tower holding her friend Evan up, and Evan is the bell always ringing. And so they are sort of ride or die for one another, but then they also challenge and push and hold each other accountable. And I think that's really important. And then she also has her family. She has a mom and a dad who play different roles as far as understanding and supporting her through her mental health journey, and a little brother who is obsessed with cooking. And he also shows his love and support through food and by boxing alongside her. And so I think that cast of characters as well helps to make your main character more human, and also show that the love that is there in different forms, not just romantic love as well.
I relate to the messy main character element of that answer, Mariama, because Valentina is almost like the roadblock at the start of the book. And I've heard people talk before about like one of the good ways to show kind of a character change is like when they have a call to action and they don't do it, and then later on you see them do the thing that they should have done like earlier on. And so weirdly enough, a big thing for me in getting her to a place where she could like, you know, get past all that was that I had to let her be very messy and behave very poorly at times in the book, and like giving myself permission to let her do that and recognize like, yeah, most of my like friends and family that have read the book and can be bluntly honest with me and are like, yeah, I didn't really like her at the start. And I'm like, yeah, because she's a 17-year-old who has been traumatized by the grief of losing her mother, and she has a very bad father who does not know how to deal with that trauma as well. And so the way that she behaves is a direct response to all of that, and it's not okay. But like I had to have that kind of empathy for her, and then it was about building that sort of empathetic network around her, but also, yeah, holding her accountable. So she has to apologize at times, and she has to recognize that what she's doing isn't okay, and having moments where she does something wrong but reflects on it, and we see like the change in that reflection throughout the book. But also when she does things that are right and she's not just like, wow, awesome, I'm a great person, I've fixed everything. It's about the people around her recognizing that change and showing her that she has built this community of people who do genuinely trust her. And especially for a character like her, who is used to like, everything I do is a problem, everything is wrong, having people who see like, yes, you messed up, that doesn't mean we hate you, it just means you messed up and like you can keep going, was an important element of that character growth, where she can recognize she doesn't have to end the book being perfect, but she can try to be better, and that's kind of what's important at the end of the day.
I have also been told that my main character is annoying by close family and friends. So I take that as like, oh, I did something right if you're annoyed by this character.
Exactly. You can't get them to a point where they have character development if they're good at the start of the book.
They're just teenagers, you know. They're trying their best, and sometimes they're not, and that's okay too. We don't always have the ability to try our best, but we get there eventually. If anybody in the audience has any questions, you can drop them in the Q&A. I will just keep going anyways, because why wouldn't I take the opportunity that has been presented to me to make all of these lovely people talk to me. So everyone here has got a couple books under their belt at this point. So is there any lesson that you learned from your first couple or first books that you think really helped you out writing this particular one? Or did this feel like a whole new experience where you were relearning it all over again, or some combination of the two things?
I think because my first book was not a romance, and all of the character relationships that I had to really rely on were about building like really close personal relationships, a lot of like self relationship, that was worded weirdly, like a relationship with their self, and then also family relationships. That was helpful walking into this book because I knew I wanted to write a romance, but I also understood the importance of the main character having relationships with a bunch of different people. Like Spence said a few times, like romantic love not being the most important thing, even if the story is about a romance, and this one being a straight up romance, not just like a contemporary with romantic elements. That was something that I really appreciated having done with my first book, because it allowed me to not just rely solely on the crutch of Leticia for Valentina. Like I didn't want her entire personal growth arc to just be about, you know, being nicer to the girl she likes, but you know, deal with the messy dynamics of friends, of having an entire team, of having family. That was really important to me. So I think my first book helped me learn how to cultivate a lot of interpersonal relationships that didn't hinge as much on just like the quick and easy sometimes notion of like a romance or like a trope or something, so that I could flesh out the relationships between my characters better in this book.
I gaslight myself every book. So I think every book is its own puzzle, and that's part of the fun and the work of being a writer. And then also every book I'm like, why did I decide to do this? I get over it. I just don't like first drafting, and it's really, really difficult for me. But I will say something that at least has gotten easier, or just this is my third book now. It's just sort of like understanding roughly how the publishing process works, and being able to focus a little bit more on things that, more on the work instead of worrying about numbers and things like that with my first book or anything like that. So I think that has changed. But I'm still a slow first drafter. And then a revision is what I love because I get help from people, and it makes it better. And I will say that this book is my first book that is solely in verse, and so that was a big difference. But again, that because poetry is sort of my core love, and because I have a little bit of poetry in my other books, it felt very natural to just dive into writing this totally in verse from the beginning.
My first book series was very plot driven, historical fantasy. My following book was much more character driven. And I feel like both of those were helpful in writing this, especially one that's more character driven, because that really forced me to dive into characters and relationships. And I think friendships function a lot like romances too. Like you have to build them up. You have to see what the characters value in one another. And so all of that was really helpful. That said, it was definitely different writing something that was straight up romance as opposed to having other plot elements to kind of carry me through when I didn't know what was happening.
I feel like I'm a little like Mariama, where I also gaslight myself with every single book. And I feel like I've forgotten how to write or revise or do anything when I start a new book. But I do think one of the things I learned from my previous books is how to structure a book properly, because for my first two books especially, I pants them completely. And when I got my revision notes for both of them, my editor was like, yeah, your third act needs like a lot of work. Where is your midpoint? What is happening with your midpoint? And I was like, okay. And so she kind of like taught me what a story structure really looks like, because I apparently really struggled with midpoints and like what comes after a midpoint and just pacing it out properly. And so when I got my revision notes for this book, I was pleasantly surprised that nobody asked me about the midpoint, or nobody asked me to like rewrite the entire third act of the book. So I do feel like I learned a lot about just like structuring, and also how to plot a book properly so that you are nailing that structure and nailing all of those story beats.
All right, and I will give my last call for questions before I ask my final one. And then after this question, if we don't have any questions, I'll turn it over to Kathy and Willow. So just in general, like we come to romance, right? Because it's you feel good. You just feel good, right? Even when the characters are going through hard times, there's gonna be an okay sign at the end. Like we're good, we're getting there. Like everything's gonna work out. So what are some of the things that have sort of led you to feel like that? Is it something self-care? Is it something some TV show that you're like, oh my God, like I feel great now, like we've gotten to the end of this and I just feel happy? I mean, I know you can't get to the end of anything anymore because everything gets canceled, but like there used to be things that didn't get canceled, so like maybe you like an older show, I don't know. What's the thing that has sort of made you feel like the end of a romance book outside of maybe romance books? Or you can talk about romance books. We can talk about romance books all day.
I can go. I do love an older TV show that didn't get canceled, so I could rewatch it a million times, and rewatching it was one of the reasons I started writing this book. I'm obsessed with the Australian teen drama Dance Academy that came out in like, what was it? It was probably like the early 2010s, so it's not like old, but I love it a lot. And the official like account, whatever, they have all the episodes for free on YouTube. So I rewatch it like once a year, and I was rewatching it when I decided to write You Know How to Shop, because I was getting really into like the canvas of athletics. It's like a ballet academy, so like the canvas of sports for interpersonal relationships, and I know soccer intimately, so I was like, I could do that. But I think that's one of my favorite, just because I've watched it so many times that it makes me feel very nice to come back to it. It also ended happy, which is another issue with TV shows these days, is they love to do a sad plot twist ending that's not well written just for the fun of it all. And then you don't want to rewatch
The 100.
Yeah, exactly. There's a reason I didn't say a different couple earlier. And so Dance Academy has always been comforting for me in that notion. And then also listening to music is a very nice thing for me, especially when it comes to writing. If I'm like struggling with stuff emotionally, but also if I'm struggling to picture stuff in my writing, listening to music is very helpful. I feel like it is the other art, media, whatever, outside of like writing books that I think influences my work as much as books do. So listening to music is always a very comforting thing for me and makes me feel like the end of a romance novel, I suppose.
For me, I really love animations, just because they're just so nice, and they do usually, like, I guess you have to be watching the right kind of animation, but usually they have like a happy ending, and those are the ones I usually choose to watch. And then I also love like kids shows, just for like the same reason. One of my favorite shows like to come out of like recently was the Babysitters Club, the new version of it. But then obviously it had to get canceled, which was incredibly depressing. But I absolutely love that. Like, I think that's what I went back to all the time when I was like having like a bad day or whatever, because it was just so like wholesome. And then I don't know if this counts, but I watched a lot of like baking shows and cooking shows while I was writing this book, because I had to, but also I know a lot of them do get like very messy, which I do enjoy. Like, I love the drama of the reality TV shows. But then there are some that are very, very wholesome, like the Great British Bake Off. And then I think also like MasterChef Australia is very wholesome and very much about like the craft of like cooking as well. So I really enjoyed watching that too.
Reality baking shows are definitely one of the things that I go to. I also just love TV comedy series, some of them. But there's something comforting about sitting down for 20 minutes at the end of the day, like letting my brain shut off a little bit, knowing, that I will laugh. I mean, my husband and I have been watching Never Have I Ever, which I think is such a great example of like all kinds of like Davy makes terrible choices, but her family still loves her, and she's going to work it out with her friends, and that whatever else happens, she's going to be okay. And I guess I just really love that. That's part of the reason I read romances, like Rachel was saying, that no matter what else happens, there's going to be a happy ending at the end of it. So
actually in the other room right now, my goddaughter is visiting me and my wife, and she is watching Never Have I Ever because we introduced it to her. And we watched Heartstopper with her last summer when she came to visit us. So those types of shows I really love. Shows where teens are allowed to be messy and make mistakes and make poor choices, but ultimately there's some community thread, some thread there that's also still heartwarming. I also love music, and music is really important to my writing process. I actually this is probably also a procrastination tool, but I make a playlist for every book I write, probably at the start, because I'm like, I need to know the mood, the theme. So I spend a lot of time making a playlist, and actually there is a playlist in the back of Forever is now a title track list that informs a lot of Sadie's story. And then the last thing I will say that gives me that feeling is boxing as a form of joy and stress relief, and getting anger out and emotion has been something that I have really enjoyed and turned to as self-care, and joy is an act of resistance over the last few years. And so I directly and specifically wrote that into Sadie's story because it's so important to me, just as a form of, it feels really good to hit something, but like without consequence, maybe consequence on your body because you're sore, but other than that, no.
All righty. Well, that's my bit done. I am going to turn it back over to Kathy. Kathy!
Had to wait for Caroline to spotlight me. Rachel, you are an incredible moderator. Those questions were so thoughtful and great. Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
And I loved that last question, because the Great British Baking Show makes me so very happy. I just rewatch it over and over and over again. It's just so soothing.
Some days I just go on this final episode where she wins. Spoiler, it's been out for a really long time, and like she has a whole career. Like I feel like we're past the point where that's a shock. But like her, I just like sit there and sob when I need to,
Absolutely. And that final is just perfection, because there's everybody. I mean, there were a couple of small errors, but nothing like tragic that happens sometimes in a final. There's one final that just makes me so sad every time I watch it. I can't watch it. Anyway, we won't go down that road right now. I want to close, first of all, by thanking you all for being here and thanking you for your creative endeavors that provide such a great reflection, a mirror and a window to teens across the world. So thank you for that. And then I'm going to wrap by asking our favorite question, which is, can you please tell us a book of your heart? It doesn't have to be the book of your heart. It just has to be a book of your heart. And P.S. Rachel, you have to answer this too. So let's start with Raquel. We're going to go Raquel, Adiba, Rachel, Mariama, Rosalind.
I will say Cracked Up to Be by Courtney Summers is one of the books of my heart, because it was one of the earliest YA books I ever read. I read it way too young. But I have adored her work since, and just messy teenage girls is always going to be something I'm interested in media about.
Yeah, I'm going to say From Twinkle with Love by Sandhya Menon, because similarly, I loved seeing a messy South Asian girl in a YA book, because we never ever get to see that until we had Baby, I guess.
I'm cheating because I didn't know I got to answer this, and so I'm taking the opportunity to do two. Upside of Unrequited by Becky Albertalli, because I am the non-Jewish version of that character. Like every other part of it, I was like, oh my God, this is me. And like Becky and I joke that it is me, because it just every aspect, the anxiety, the fat rap. It was the first time I really saw myself in a character. But the answer is Pictures in the Light by Kelly Lou Gilbert. Always. Like I will shout that book from the rooftops for the rest of my life. It should have gotten every award that it was eligible for the year that it came out, because it is just the most beautiful, and it's the one that I can hand to somebody and guarantee that they will send me an angry text being like, why did you do this to my emotions? And the answer is yes. So
I'm gonna say a pretty recent book, but it instantly became a book of my heart, which is We Deserve Monuments by Jazz Hammond. It is a book I devoured, and a book that I love so much. It is about romantic love. There is a love story, and I loved the, queer girls in the South figuring out their identities and falling in love and reclaiming their joy. But it's also about family and trauma and messiness, and returning to a place full of history that informs your everyday, but you don't always understand. And I just thought it was beautifully written, and I'm recommending it to everyone, and I will reread it again and again. I just think that they did such a good job with this book, and I can't wait to see what they write later.
Just want to second Rachel's shout out for Kelly Lou Gilbert. Her books are amazing. I'm actually teaching at a writing conference this week, and I've been using her as an example. But the book that I picked was Stacey Lee's The Downstairs Girl, which has all of the elements that I love in historical, which is impeccable research and a super smart character. Stacey's books are always smart, but this one especially, like she just has such great insights into gender relationship and racial relationships. And I loved it. And the romance was fun too.
I love all of those very much. We have them on our shelves and are always happy to sell them. And many of those authors have visited us. So what a joy to have you name all of them. Those of you who joined us, and you wonderful creators, thank you, thank you, thank you. What a lovely hour to spend with you. I'm so grateful. We are going to put this up on our YouTube channel, and we're going to send the list of books to everybody who registered. And I hope you all have a great evening. And thank you again for spending time with us. Everybody have a great night.
Thank you.
thank
Good-
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.